of all of our ministers and those involved in this space.
I thank the honourable member for Forrest. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a great opportunity for me today to lend my words and support to the bill, the Crimes Legislation Amendment, Powers and Offences and Other Measures Bill 2015. There's no doubt that there's a suite of measures in this bill which address, quite frankly, the most fundamentally important thing for any government, the most fundamentally important thing for any parliament, and that is ultimately the security and safety and order of our society and the safety of our people. Because if we're unable to guarantee the safety and security of our people, in effect any other discussion or argument that we have in this place is rendered, quite frankly, meaningless. So the suite of measures that are being proposed in this bill take us a long way to addressing a number of areas where I think it's fair to say we've seen gaps in our existing legal, security and law enforcement framework. And this bill seeks to deliver on a number of key commitments that we made prior to the last election to ensure that the Commonwealth legal framework is up to date and robust when it comes to providing our law enforcement agencies the tools that they need to do their job and reduce the impact that crime has on our communities. In particular, this bill seeks to make a number of changes in the broadly the four following areas: gun-related crime, serious drug offences including importation, forced marriage and proceeds of crime. So I'll seek to briefly address each of those four key areas. With respect to gun-related crime and illegal firearms, again, to ensure the safety of our community, to ensure the safety of our broader society, we know from the swift and important decisions made by the Howard government back in the mid-90s that being able to limit the number of firearms of any description in our society will have an appreciable and positive impact on gun-related or firearm crime. Obviously, the last thing that we would ever want is to see in Australia the prevalence of gun crime that you see in many other jurisdictions around the world, most notably the United States, which of course is culturally very different, obviously with their constitution, but we see the outcome, the prevalence of illegal firearms in their communities. We see the outcome of that, and it's quite horrific. And I think over the last 15 or 20 years we have probably patted ourselves on the back a lot and said, haven't we done fantastically well in ensuring illegal firearms have been, in effect, expunged and removed from our society with the gun buyback. It's fair to say, though, that over that period of time, criminal networks, criminals in general, have become extraordinarily adept at getting illegal firearms into this country, and they're often the worst type of firearm. They are handguns, easily concealed, and the source of many, many crimes. So that's why we took to the election a commitment to implement tougher penalties on those who engage in gun-related crime. And this bill seeks to fulfil that commitment in a number of ways, including through introducing, and this is one that I'm particularly proud of, mandatory minimum sentences of 5 years imprisonment for offences for offenders charged with trafficking of firearms or firearm parts under the Criminal Code. And as I've said many times in this House in relation to a range of criminal matters, mandatory minimum sentences are an extraordinarily powerful way for the legislature to ensure that the wishes of our communities, the wishes of the Australian public are met. Because I don't want to use my contribution to bash the judiciary, but far too often, in every range of crime that you look at, the judiciary do not reflect the wishes, the values and the expectations of our community. That's the sad reality. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that that's the primary reason that's motivated this particular change, but as somebody who has been a long-time advocate for mandatory minimum sentences, to say to somebody, if you're going to illegally try and bring in a firearm, a handgun or a handgun part, or perhaps a whole heap of handgun parts that you will then later assemble, you're going to have a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. And I think every single person in this House and 99.9% of people in the Australian community would sleep extraordinarily well at night knowing that that person will have a 5-year sentence. The second major area that this bill seeks to address, or the major areas of concern that we spoke about before the election that we want to address, is in relation to serious drug offences. And we've heard some wonderful contributions about the impact of drugs and the reality of precursor drugs in particular being brought into Australia and the impact it's having on our communities. So this again is a very, very important way that we can do some practical things to arm our law enforcement agencies with the ability to address the importation and the sale of those drugs. Most notably, I look back to April this year when the Prime Minister, along with Minister Keenan and Nash, announced the establishment of a national task force to address the growing danger of crystal methamphetamine. And I've held forums in my electorate and indeed in neighbouring electorates, and there's no doubt that this is a significant issue that is absolutely hitting communities across the country, and I don't think there's any community that's immune. And importantly, the task force was set up to provide a forensic assessment of the problems that this drug is causing to the health, welfare and safety of our community and how we can fix the problem most importantly. But we're also wanting to give our law enforcement agencies the powers, the resources that they need to actually limit the supply of these drugs to start with. And our law enforcement agencies, most particular in this case the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service and the Australian Federal Police, have had some success. So we know that they can do it. We know they have the skill and the ability to stop a lot of methamphetamine and precursors being brought into our country, but we've got to give them the tools. Don't ask them to do their job with one hand tied behind their back, and this legislation unties that hand. And one example was 150 kilograms of ice, which was stopped only a couple of months ago by those two agencies, and that's 150 kilograms of drugs that would do untold damage to our community. It's not just causing untold damage to our communities, but it's also a major attraction for organised crime, and the more that organised crime can peddle in these drugs, the greater the resources that they ultimately have to cause other mischief within our society. The bill seeks to improve, importantly, the operation of the serious drug and precursor offences in the criminal code, and this seeks to make recklessness the fault element for attempted offences and removes the intent to manufacture element from offences relating to the importation of border-controlled precursors. The amendments in this bill seek to more easily enable the enforcement of border control in this area, ultimately, without affecting the legitimate use of these chemicals in industry, and it improves our ability to bring justice to those who seek to profit from the manufacturing of drugs such as ice. What could be worse? Somebody getting rich, ruining our communities, ruining lives, ruining families. Another area that very importantly that this bill seeks to address is forced marriage. I never thought that in Australia, in federal parliament, we'd have to be discussing forced marriage. Perhaps naive of me, but I never thought that that medieval, barbaric undertaking would be an issue that we had to deal with in Australia. But sadly it is. And we can't pretend it doesn't happen. We can't try to appease certain lobby groups by pretending these things don't happen. Our duty is to protect children. That is our duty, and that's what this bill will seek to do. Under the current legislation, forced marriage offences apply in cases where an individual doesn't consent freely and fully to marry another due to coercion, deception or threat. But over the recent years, the federal police have learned of cases where, and other speakers have mentioned this, girls as young as 12 have consented to be married to much older males. How can a 12-year-old consent? How? It's absolutely outrageous that, quite frankly, it's taken the Australian Parliament this long to fix it. I mean, it really is quite embarrassing that it's taken both sides of politics this long to fix it, but I commend the Minister. He has acted swiftly, he has seen a problem, he has made an election commitment, and he has absolutely ensured that to the best of our abilities we can address it. So the bill amends the Act to state that forced marriage has occurred in a situation where one of the parties ultimately is incapable of making an informed decision. Now, a 12-year-old can't enter into a contract, a 12-year-old can't do many things because they cannot consent. They cannot make an informed decision. Therefore, the legislation brings in line our criminal law with what is absolutely within community expectations. And there's nothing controversial about this, but it took the current minister to make the change, and he must therefore be absolutely commended for doing that, and I know it has huge support in the community, and I think in years to come there will be, and we won't be able to record it in any way, we won't be able to measure it, but in years to come there will be countless women in Australia who we will have saved from a life of subjugation and, quite frankly, abuse. And that's why that is probably one of the best parts of this bill. Finally, in the four broad areas that I mentioned at the beginning, the last was some amendments regarding proceeds of crime. Look, again, in the community, in my electorate, I think in probably every 150 electorates around this country, Australians do not want to see anybody engaging in illicit activities who can ultimately profit from those crimes. Crime just can't pay. How else do we remove the incentive for those people tempted to get into crime? So in this bill, we're seeking to make amendments which really enhance the Proceeds of Crime Act to ensure that the old adage of crime not paying actually does apply. It increases existing penalties for failing to comply with a production order or with a notice to a financial institution in proceeds of crime investigations. No longer will people be able to flout our law enforcement agencies when they're exercising those notices and proceedings. It also increases the integrity of the process for appointing persons to conduct proceeds of crime examinations, facilitate the administration of confiscated Commonwealth assets by the official trustee in bankruptcy, and addresses ambiguity in a range of other existing provisions. So this bill does a lot, and it does a great deal of good to ensuring that our society is safer, that we are meeting our election commitments in an earnest fashion, and I therefore commend the bill to the House.